Welcome to Theories and Problems in Visual Art. This is Concepts Lecture number 8 on the sublime and the beautiful. I'm going to talk first about Kant, the 18th century philosopher who defined beauty and the sublime for most people ever since, and then the philosophic field of aesthetics, which is the study of beauty, and the way that it looks in other cultures and from other cultures' viewpoints. So Kant's Critique of Judgment, which you see there on the right in its first edition, is the third book in a series that he wrote that discusses issues of epistemology. That's the study of what can be known, especially space and time, which come up in the next couple of lectures. This book, The Critique of Judgment, centers on what Kant calls reflective judgments, and that includes the beautiful, the sublime. It's a particular kind of judgment. When you say something is beautiful, according to Kant, you're not identifying anything about it. There is no, quote, determinate concept involved. The judgment that something is beautiful just sounds like this, ooh, ah, and you're not allowed to use words because it's a kind of judgment that happens non-conceptually, or as Kant says, there's no determinate concept. Once you start describing the thing that you find beautiful and you're naming it and saying why you think it's beautiful, then you're not making an aesthetic judgment anymore. You may be making another kind of judgment that he studies in the other two books in the series, like an applied judgment or an epistemological claim. When you say something is sublime, Kant says, then you're making the judgment that it's beyond your comprehension. Your principal feelings are fear or awe. This photo is of a phenomenon called a green flash, which is something that happens every once in a while when the sun sets over the ocean. Right before it sets, it'll green flash. People watch for this, and there's pictures of it on the internet. I have it here because I want it as a reminder that Kant doesn't apply the sublime to artworks. He does talk about beautiful artworks, but he doesn't talk about sublime artworks. But ever since his book, people have applied the word to art. So it has been part of the discourse on art for several centuries now. So actually, I think very few people in the world study Kant, actually read these books. They're long, they're dense, they're extremely abstract. What matters more is how his ideas are remembered and used. It's the idea of Kant rather than, you might say, the actual Kant. And in this case, 3 ideas that are attributed to him are especially influential in the art world. That is a death mask of Kant. First influential Kantian idea is that beauty is non-conceptual. Aesthetic thinking is beyond the conceptual. Second is that aesthetic judgment is disinterested interest. That's a famous expression, meaning that you don't want to own or understand the artwork when you make an aesthetic judgment. If you go up to a painting in a museum, you feel this aesthetic judgment and you feel disinterested interest, means you don't want to take the painting down off the wall and steal it. You don't want to know about the patrons who gave it to the museum and who they were, how wealthy they were, anything like that. The work doesn't have a use for you. Your interest is disinterested. That's Kant's criterion for an aesthetic judgment. And third, beauty and the sublime are leading concepts in aesthetic judgment, and in Kant they are contrasted against as ethics and epistemology, which are in his other 2 books in the series. In the art world, though, that changed a little bit, and aesthetic qualities are contrasted against political and social artwork. So it's a shift in meaning, and it's also a move away from Kant's system. It's an extraction of ideas and the putting to use of those ideas in a completely different context. So first, beauty. Especially since postmodernism, since the 1960s or so, beauty has generally been something that artists have wanted to avoid. In the 90s and the 2000s, beauty was a terrible thing to hear in a studio. You didn't want to have your instructor say your work was beautiful because that made it sound like your work was useless. Art was supposed to have non-aesthetic purposes. It was meant to do something in the world. It was meant to make claims, to change people's minds, to challenge people. It wasn't supposed to be just beautiful. But in the last 20 years or so, there have been a number of attempts to revive the concept of beauty. And I'm going to survey them here, some of them, in order to make the point that actually there are a number of different motives for this revival of beauty. It's not just one thing. It's sometimes said that there has been a revival of beauty, but it's many different ones. And they are reacting against different things. They're not all reacting against postmodernism in the same way, for example. In art school, the earliest revivals of beauty were made by critics, art critics, especially Dave Hickey, also Peter Schjeldahl, who used to write for The New Yorker, and a number of others, mostly North Americans. In my experience, their writing is not discussed in universities. Other people that I'll show on the next screens have been widely discussed in universities in relation to beauty, but these are art critics who are read and discussed in art schools. Dave Hickey's book, Air Guitar, that you see here, it's a mix of essays in and around the idea that art should be wild and honest, direct, and sensually challenging. He takes Robert Mapplethorpe for one of his main examples in this revival of beauty, and he's also interested in a whole range of transgressive art and some regional art. He was very often read in art schools as a license not to worry about art theory, not to pay attention to your art history teacher or to academic writing, but just to be wild, be a cowboy. And it was quite a celebrity for a time. I think that that may have faded after about 2010 or so, but there was a period when he drew huge crowds when he came to speak at the School of the Art Institute. He filled one of the main auditoria in the Art Institute, and lines went down the block of Michigan Avenue and then across to the next block and over to the park. And I had students in my classes who refused to read anything except Dave Hickey. It was largely because his attitude was anti-academic, and his message was you can ignore history and you can ignore your teachers. It wasn't so much that he was reviving beauty, but his examples and the way that he wrote and the way that he talked were very influential because he was interested in opening the gates to kinds of work that were different from what he thought of as kind of repressive, cold, postmodern intellectual work. Arthur Danto was a philosopher, he died in 2013, who wrote Art Criticism and Theory. He's tremendously influential in some parts of the world, especially China. And he's still often taught and cited in philosophy because he wrote on many things other than art. His book, The Abuse of Beauty, is the most frequently cited example of the revival of beauty. And there's more on Danto with his theories of Warhol and others in history lectures 11 and 12. There he is when he was a bit younger. But the abuse of beauty is actually not a defense of beauty in art. What Danto wants to do is extend aesthetics to talk about things other than beauty and the sublime, to talk about, for example, the dainty and the dumpy. John Austin was a philosopher whose name comes up in performance art, and I'm going to talk about him in other lectures as well. Austin was interested in what are called minor aesthetic qualities other than beauty and the sublime, including things like dainty and dumpy. Danto was interested also in minor aesthetic qualities that Kant had mentioned. Kant talks a little bit about the innocent, the modest, and the tender. Danto was interested in the everyday, ordinary qualities. That would include dainty and dumpy. Duchamp called those everyday qualities the anesthetic. It was a kind of a clever way of saying that they weren't the major aesthetic terms. They were anesthetic terms. The silly, which was Kant's proposal for the opposite of the sublime. It's a really interesting idea. And it has been written about recently, but for a long time it was ignored. Danto was one of the first to point to the fact that everyone talks about the sublime and no one asks what the opposite of the sublime is, but it was the silly. And Danto was also interested in the disgusting, which Kant says is an aesthetic property that's immune to the beautiful. Something that can't ever be made beautiful is disgusting. So this is what the abuse of beauty is about. It's not a revival of beauty, it's an expansion of aesthetics. But still, he's associated with the revival of beauty in art. There are also revivals of beauty outside the art world. These are three academics that teach at major universities who have written on beauty. It's Elaine Scarry on the right, Alexandra Nahamas on the bottom, Wendy Steiner on the left. Steiner is particularly interested in gender critique. She associates the sublime with the value of modernism with is gendered male. And her book Venus in Exile, The Rejection of Beauty in 20th Century Art, is about reasons why beauty was rejected and her argument that it should be reinstated. Some of these revivals of beauty are culturally conservative, and they don't engage postmodern and contemporary art. Their idea is more to return to some period either before modernism or even in European art back to the Greeks, in the case of Alexandra Nahamas, when beauty was still a fundamental value. So instead of directly engaging with postmodernism, like people like Dave Hickey did, some of these authors are more interested in reformulating the conversation so that we can go back to some ideal configuration of aesthetics or the value of beauty. There are a lot of revivals of beauty, and some of them are actually religious, faith-based. That's a theme I'm going to explore in Concepts Lecture 25. The Protestant theologian Karl Barth said, quote, "Beauty is how we are persuaded or awakened to faith." So that's an interesting idea about beauty that you won't hear much in the art world. But Barth and others have been very influential outside the art world. John Updike, the novelist, for example, was interested in Barth. That screenshot is from a faith-based conference at Lipscomb University, which is a Christian university. And the speaker there is a Catholic poet who was talking about beauty in the academy. So this is just by way of saying that revivals of beauty are really miscellaneous and cross boundaries between disciplines and parts of culture. There is no single revival of beauty, but in general, it's perceived to be, this return of beauty, perceived to be a reaction against what was thought to be overly intellectual or overly conceptual tendencies in postmodernism. If you're interested in this word, beauty, in relation to your own work, you could pick one of these or others to see if they fit your practice, because some of them are very interesting and have been influential on contemporary artists. The sublime. In Kant, there's a description of the sublime which amounts to 4 different stages. And I'm going to show these one screen after another. They're not numbered in Kant, but his account of the sublime is compatible with this kind of schema. And afterwards, I'll show why I'm dividing this into 4 parts. So here's how the sublime works according to Kant. His example is the starry sky. So say you're inside, and say you're like, it's something noisy and something noisy and bright, like a club or a bar or something like that. And then you step outside, not really thinking about anything in particular, and you see the sky is full of stars. So you're transfixed. You stand there looking, without moving, without talking. Kant says you feel awe and terror. Terror is a kind of 18th century word here, so maybe it's not the best one, but awe. And some modern scholars like to say pain. You feel discomfort. You're suddenly really taken out of yourself, and you're presented with this overwhelming experience. In the second stage, then, you realize that you have words for what you're seeing. It's not just a vast, limitless nothingness, right? There are stars and galaxies, that's the universe, there's eternity. Kant says the crucial word that you think of is infinite. And this realization produces pleasure because you can now control your experience with language. You can talk about the Milky Way, or you can talk about constellations, and you can bring out whatever knowledge you happen to have about the universe. But then if you reflect a minute, you realize that those words really don't mean much, because nobody experiences infinity or eternity. By our nature, we don't. And words like stars and galaxies, or fancy words like pulsar or something, they're all English language words, and they're, of course, totally inadequate to whatever enormous object they're supposedly identifying. So this results in a second moment of awe, or in modern psychological terms, pain. And last, Kant says that you realize that as a rational person, you at least have the capacity to think about these problems. Your language isn't adequate, no language is adequate, but at least you can analyze what you've been saying and you can criticize your words. Kant calls this capacity supra-rational, the ability to think about reasoning, and it produces a second moment of quote-unquote pleasure. So those are the four stages of the sublime, the way that Kant describes it, and here they are again. The initial moment of awe or terror, the awareness of language like infinity or galaxy, the awareness that you have language. A second moment of awe or terror at the realization of the fact that it's just a language. And then a recuperation, thanks to the supra-rational capacity to ponder these questions. There have been a number of different attempts to write a postmodern sublime. It's a whole field of study in itself, the postmodern sublime. There are so many writers who have contributed theories that update Kant's. The postmodern sublime in general, as a generalization, works this way. The first stages are the same. You still see the starry sky, you feel awe and terror. You do use words like infinity or galaxy or whatever. There is this second moment when you realize that the language is not working. But in postmodern sublimes, there is no recuperation because you realize we're all inside language. We're incapable of thinking outside language. We're trapped by the words we have, and that includes the word supra-rational. So there's no comfort to be had in the realization that we have some supra-rational capacity to ponder. In other words, that we have the capacity to reflect or that we're introspective. So no comfort in that because those things are also trapped inside language. Basically what you have is an overwhelming apparition of this astonishing universe that we live in, and then contrasted with that, this really pathetic and ridiculous structure of language that we built to try to cope with it. A note about religion before I go on. These ideas, awe, wonder, the infinite, the eternal, terror, and all that, they're all also used in religion. They're also used to describe religious experience. Kant's book and the chapters on the sublime were intended as a secular philosophic account to be strictly separated from religious faith. His book is not a religious book, and it was intended from the beginning that way. In Concepts Lecture 25 on religion, these same words, awe, wonder, infinite, and the eternal, they are going to come back, but in that case, moving from religion into art. But it's important to know about aesthetics in general and about beauty and the sublime and all of these, that they are part of an Enlightenment 18th century project. Kant was part of this project, which involved the separation of philosophy from religion. So this is a kind of a veiled, the whole book on the sublime, books from that period on the sublime and the beautiful are kind of a veiled, non-religious way of writing, which actually is religious, you could say, because it uses the same concepts, reports on the same experiences. Some other postmodern sublimes, there are a lot of them. On the lower left, that's a book by Jean-François Lyotard, whose name is going to come back in a couple of other lectures because he theorized postmodernism. The one second from the right is especially interesting, and I'm just going to put a couple screens up about that. I'm not going to talk about the whole range of other books on the postmodern sublime. So this book, The Romantic Sublime, was written by a literary historian, Thomas Weiskell, and it has a couple of very useful ideas in it. He describes two postmodern sublimes that he calls negative and positive. Weiskell thinks that the sublime in general, negative or positive, any sublime, is caused by a sudden change in what he calls the density of experience. So for the negative sublime, when you step outside after spending an evening indoors in their bright, noisy club or whatever, the density of your experience suddenly drops. Suddenly there's no noise, suddenly there's no light, suddenly there's, instead of crowded spaces, there's infinite space. The density of your experience drops, and that produces what he calls the negative sublime. So this is a way of thinking about the sublime in kind of psychological, cognitive psychological terms, that we can only deal with gradual changes in the density of our experience. When the density of our experience, in this case, drops too precipitously, then we're put into a state of confusion or awe and terror and so on, which is the sublime. The other side is the positive sublime. That's when the density of your experience suddenly increases. For example, if you're climbing up a mountainside, but then you come over the top and you see a volcano. There's an 18th century version of this in a book on the sublime where you're walking in a garden. You used to imagine like an English gentleman or something like that, walking in their garden, and you see a hedge, and you wonder what's beyond it. So you reach up to it and you try to part the leaves, and when you part them, you see you're facing a tiger. So there's an 18th century version of this same idea. It's too steep a change, too radical, too quick a change in the density of your experience, and it produces an effect of the positive sublime. Artworks have made use of both of these. You can do them. You can set up these kinds of changes in your artworks, positive and negative sublimes. And I'm going to conclude with a couple of thoughts on aesthetics. In general, aesthetics is the part of philosophy that studies these questions of beauty and the sublime. There's a wide range of ideas about whether or not beauty and the sublime should be part of the art world, and I think I have 4, maybe 5 examples of attempts to create aesthetic theories within the art world. Nicolas Bourriaud is a critic and a curator who's mostly associated with the idea of relational aesthetics. This is a theory that the relations between objects, like artworks, their galleries, artists, the gallerists, and so on, the relation between objects in the art world is what matters in art, the relations themselves. And that expression, relational aesthetics, means that the aesthetic value, the beauty, the sublimity, or whatever it is, comes from the relation between these objects. In order to bring it out, then, you have to change their relations. What matters, he says, is the network or archipelago of new relations. He doesn't use the word aesthetics, which is important. He's avoiding it because he doesn't want to be compared with the field of aesthetics. But that's what this is. It's an application of, or a reinvention of aesthetics. The most famous example of relational aesthetics in the art world is Rirkrit Tir-Veneja, who has done work where galleries are rearranged. For example, in the most famous of his pieces, he took all the things from the back of a gallery, that's the filing cabinets and the desks and all the rest of that, and brought them out into the front, and then he took all the artworks that are normally in the front and put them in the back. So he's also done things like you see in the photograph here, where you go into a gallery and there may be art, but also what's going on is that he's cooking for you. So changing relations between parts of the art world, and the idea of relational aesthetics is that it's not the objects themselves, it's not like the mural in the background there or the food that's in the foreground that produces the aesthetic value. It's not that that's beautiful or sublime food or it has any qualities in particular. It's not that, it's that the functions of them have changed, their relations have changed, producing a new network or archipelago of new relations. And that is what creates aesthetic value. It's the actual shifting around of the parts of the art world. Michael Kelly is a philosopher who edited this multi-volume Encyclopedia of Aesthetics. There are 400 contributors in this. There are a lot of essays about aesthetics, and a certain number of them are about aesthetics outside of the West and outside of contemporary international art. So those essays in particular raise questions like, do cultures other than those influenced by Kant have aesthetics? And if so, are those aesthetic systems different from Kant's and from the people influenced by Kant? There are a number of scholarly studies of specific cases. For example, I think the largest one is the study of Yoruba aesthetics. So the Yoruba culture, which is also a people and a language in West Africa, has a vocabulary for art making that's been studied by several generations of art historians and anthropologists. And they do have terms which seem to be like terms like beauty and the sublime. But these are very tricky to translate because they come from a very different cultural context. So the discussions around examples like Yoruba aesthetics are the turn on the question of whether or not word that seems to be beauty really is enough like beauty so that it can count as a good translation, or if there's some completely different system at work. And if there isn't a system, is there really something you could call aesthetics? These are not easily soluble problems because they depend not only on translation differences, but also on what people hope from different cultures. There is a kind of Western / Eurocentric scholar who has a vested interest in proving or showing, discovering, to make it even more colonial sounding, that some particular culture has an aesthetics, and then there are others who would have the opposite investment. So it's a complicated subject, but it is something that's driven, it drives in one direction. It goes from people who know about aesthetics into quote-unquote unfamiliar cultures. It doesn't go the other way around. So you could say that it's part of the impetus of Western thinking after the Enlightenment. Subject of another lecture, so I'm not going to go any farther with that right here, just to say that there are also discussions about what counts as international aesthetics. Joaquin Barrientos is associated with a field called geoaesthetic studies. He's a decolonial theorist. And geoaesthetics is, quote, based on the critical consideration of spatial reality as the generator of artistic discourse. So this is an emphasis on spatial and, of course, political relationships in order to understand decoloniality. And it's aesthetic, it's geoaesthetic, because it has to do with constructions of art and how those constructions, how those understandings move around the world. And last, there's a field called migratory aesthetics, sometimes also called nomadic aesthetics. And a number of different people have written on that. Mika Ball is a Dutch scholar. There's Patricia Pisters. There's a number of others. This is the study of international and transcultural aesthetic values, and especially how meanings change when art crosses borders. Diasporas are one of the main subjects of interest of migratory and nomadic aesthetics, and there are, of course, diasporas that are forced by famine and by war and so on. And then there are diasporas that are entirely unforced, but they are the migrations of first world people who travel to see biennales and things like that, the whole international art market. Both of those are combined in studies on migratory aesthetics and nomadic aesthetics. That kind of aesthetics is even more a question of politics and geography, like Barrientos, than even the previous ones. So here we're getting farther and farther away from Kant's original idea, which from his point of view would be really straining the notion on which he founded his system, which was the idea that an aesthetic judgment is non-conceptual and it has a disinterested interest, because here everything is interested. If everything is political, everything is interested. So you're at a point in some of these studies where the word aesthetics requires a special study of its own, because it becomes increasingly unclear exactly what it means. There is no consensus about how aesthetics is relevant to contemporary art. The main thing is just to decide whether you want your work to have aesthetic value at all. If you do, then any number of these writers might be of interest to you. If you don't, you might want to research the anti-aesthetic, which was the subject of Concepts Lecture 6. There is still this choice to be had about aesthetics, whether you adopt it or reject it, or take one of these different positions in between, the many shades of gray.